The distant shores of Aotearoa called to European settlers drawn by the lure of whaling and trade. Among them was Hector MacDonald, a young whaler from the unforgiving coastlines of the Scottish Hebrides. With much trepidation and unaware of what lay ahead, Hector faced a land of powerful iwi, locked in fierce conflicts over territory. In the Kapiti region, Hector immersed himself in the intricate web of Maori alliances and trade. Crossing paths with Te Rauparaha, who had taken over the Kapiti island, making it his stronghold. This encounter marked the dawn of a journey that would bind Hector to the land and its people in ways he could never imagine.
In 1819 and thereabouts, this world of the southern North Island, it's a world that had remained remarkably unchanged for generation after generation. Kurahaupa Waka, iwi had occupied this land, had really strong whakapapa relationships with each other, which doesn't mean there wasn't conflict, but it's a very stable situation. They'd moved into the northern South Island, Te Tauihu, in the 18th century, and there'd been quite a bit of disruption there. But that world is all turned upside down, initially with a combined tawa of Ngāti Toa and Ngāpui. A really odd connection when you think about it. Te Rauparaha is leading on behalf of Ngāti Toa. And their trip down there is very much a war party. It's part of what will become very much the scene for the 1820s and 1830s.
When Te Rauparaha decided to leave the Waikato, obviously there was pressures on the living resources, food resources, tribal resources, and so he decided to venture down into the Kapiti coast to look for fresher lands, lands that were suitable for his iwi. So he came down, and like anything back in the day, nothing was given. Māori being the race they were a warlike people, and I guess coming into different tribal areas, you don't get anything for nothing, and warfare was the main way of taking advantage of opportunities, and Te Rauparaha certainly did that.
He moves down to Kapiti, and that will become the basis of the Ngāti Toa relationship with the European world. He's come down because of whalers and Europeans, and he needs to connect with that world to get muskets. And one of Te Rauparaha's major success over the next 2 decades is to dominate that trade and to be the channel through which other iwi and other rangatira have to get access to that world. In 1824, there's a battle called Wairua on Kapiti, where an alliance of all of those iwi who are down there, including from the South Island, come together and do a night attack on Kapiti. And it's an extraordinary failure. They're a much larger force. They get significantly defeated. There's lots of debate about how many people are killed and the consequences, even who was there defending Kapiti. But the reality is that after that point, it's almost impossible for those iwi who are on the northern South Island, in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, in Wellington, even Kahungunu, to actually resist the invading force. And then we have a whole series of heke, of people who come down and settle on the land. More people come down from Kawhia. And then eventually, you've got very substantial heke coming down from the central North Island, Ngāti Raukawa.
So Hector came out to Aotearoa in his 20s. He would have been young, he would have been enthusiastic, he would have been full of life and full of energy. However, he would have been pretty hardy because he was working in amongst a whole lot of seasoned whalers and would have had to have coped with the social interactions as well as the fact that he was living on the water as he was coming across. My understanding is that it was a lot easier being in a shore-based whaling station, which is where he ended up, and from what I understand, again, without knowing the specifics, He led the operation of a whaling station on Kapiti Island. So he would have had to have some leadership skills in there. He would have had to be able to work with people, work through new situations, problem solve, and work through relational challenges because he was in a new environment, new people, new culture. So I think a lot of strengths played into that. It must have been quite daunting, to be fair. Coming to Aotearoa, New Zealand, what I may perceive as really, really challenging for them was probably nowhere near as challenging as what it had been over in the Hebridean Islands. They were coming from a space of starvation where there was no food for the people, where lullabies were written about and mums not having breast milk to feed their babies, where the soil was so shallow that you could barely grow anything, and it was treeless. There were no trees for shelter, there were no trees for building with. It was just a bare landscape of rock and swamp and small parts of ground where you could actually grow anything. So to come over here, while it may have been hard to feel like they were setting up from beginning and forming new relationships and navigating all those spaces, I imagine in terms of the geography of the land that they must have felt like it was an absolute blessing, because all of a sudden they could be in a space where they could settle in. They didn't have to fight the winds. They had access to the ocean still, which was very natural to them. But they also had the protection of the ngahere with all the trees and the bush, and they could grow things. They could raise stock, all of those sorts of things. So daily, yes, it still would have been a grind, absolutely. And compared to now, without a doubt, very, very challenging and difficult. However, I believe that for them, with that shift in geography, would have come a shift in perspective that actually they had more of an opportunity to learn and grow and nurture one another in their community, because they were no longer in that survival mode of just trying to keep going day by day.
Well, there's a story, isn't it? I guess for a Scottish European coming into any foreign land, and particularly New Zealand, he was faced with people unlike anything he'd seen, particularly with, the full tāmoko that the paramount chiefs had, that the warriors had, the manner in which they carried themselves, their language. I guess, the whanaungatanga was keeping with the Scottish way of life, deeply rooted and centred around that whānau, family, well-being, looking after one another, caring for one another, but in a different manner, in a different world. And for him to be able to build a relationship with not only Te Rauparaha, Ngāti Toa, but for the people that he came in contact, I guess was a testament to a man that was not only seeking opportunities, but seeking to understand that the people he was engaging with.
The 1820s and 1830s are a period nationally of extraordinary disruption. We call them the Musket Wars because they are driven in many ways by acquisition and competition for access to muskets. Access to muskets becomes an extraordinarily important part of mana, but it's also essential for survival.
When muskets were introduced into Maori society, intertribal conflicts reshaped the balance of power between iwi, profoundly altering the fabric of Maori life. Ngāti Toa and Ngāti Ruakawa used muskets to dominate the Kapiti coast and establish control over parts of the South Island. Demand for firearms led to a surge in Maori engaging with European traders. Tribes produced and traded flax, potatoes, and other goods to acquire guns and ammunition.
And that's very much true for the world that we're talking about today, which is the world of the Rangatiki, Manawatu, Horowhenua, Kapiti coast, which undergoes extraordinary upheaval in the 1820s and 1830s.
Te Rauparaha, Ngāti Toa. Obviously, he was a paramount rangatira of his time. History will say that Te Rauparaha took what he wanted, gave what he wanted, and was a huge provider for his iwi. He obviously came down from the Waikato looking for fresher opportunities, and given the man he was, and given what Māori were back in the day, and given his Manaran status, as the saying goes, it was either his way or the highway, and Te Rauparaha certainly took what he wanted, gave what he wanted, but I think also he was a fair man, and that certainly showed when he got down to the hora whenua, and he made connections with the local iwi down there. But history will also tell us that he was a deep-thinking person, a deep-thinking man, and cared a lot for not only his people, but the mana of his people and whānau as well.
Whaling station on Kapiti was a hub of activity, bringing new goods and technologies to the region. For Te Rauparaha and Ngāti Ruakawa, it offered a strategic opportunity, while for Hector, it was a chance to build a new life.
So he arrives at 20 and he establishes a whaling station. Now, you don't just do that. You need capital. You need capital to employ European workers, though Māori workers will be involved as well, but many of these are European gangs that are put forward. You need capital to feed them. You need capital to provide the resources that you're going to trade with Māori. So he obviously brings that capital with him, which makes him an entrepreneur. And many of the entrepreneurs who are coming into this area, they're not just out there to make money. There's lots of evidence that's showing that Europeans coming to New Zealand are coming because it's a freer place to be. It's a place without some of the economic restrictions.
Hector was very fortunate in the fact that Te Rauparaha gave him an invitation to come and settle on the mainland at hora whenua in the Kapiti area. And within that was the building of relationships across the hapu. Hector the whaler was a person looking for a home. Hector was very much a nurturer. I think Hector had an entrepreneurial streak. He recognised opportunities as they arose.
Certainly we know that at the age of 20 he came over to Kapiti Island and established a whaling base on the island. It would have required a very clear arrangement with Ngāti Toa and Te Rauparaha in particular. If what MacDonald did was done in other parts of Aotearoa at this time, it would have meant an arrangement whereby effectively the land was leased, enough land to set up the whaling station, to grow some vegetables, to process the whales once they were caught, and quite likely the right to chase whales in a defined part of the sea as well. And all that would have been a relationship that was in the nature of a lease, and Te Rauparaha would have expected to benefit from it in terms of useful goods, in terms perhaps of a relationship with other parts of the Tasman world, and perhaps too in terms of a market for some of the other produce that came off the areas that he controlled.
What Te Rauparaha wanted was people who had capital, people who could trade, people who could establish a whaling station, which is what MacDonald does. And in turn, he provides a niece as a marriage partner. Marriages are a key aspect of how the Māori world relates with each other. Marriages are not based on romance so much as arranged between rangatira families to cement relationships, to make peace, to seek an economic advantage.
Through the relationship that Hector and Te Rauparaha built, I guess Te Rauparaha wanted to cement that relationship, and what better way to do that was through marrying one of his nieces, or giving one of his nieces to Hector as a bride. And I guess having that connection and having that relationship between MacDonald and the Kopi and obviously Te Rauparaha, it would have built a relationship that was beneficial to both parties.
The promise of prosperity came with its own challenges. As the number of European settlers increased, life began to shift under the weight of new technologies and trades, threatening the traditional ways of the Maori world.
Whaling had been conducted by European and American seafarers in these waters since the early part of the 19th century. But originally a lot of it was based at sea, so the whaling ships spent long periods at sea. By the mid-1820s, they were starting to base themselves on the shore in places like Kapiti around the Cook Strait coast and up and down the east coasts of the South Island, among other places. And the establishment might have looked fairly rough and ready to our eyes. It would have consisted of several buildings, accommodation, places to sleep and eat. There would have been sheds to store the whalebone and whale oil once it was processed. The whales would have been carved up on the beach, and there would have been very big pots, tripots they were called, in which the whale blubber was rendered down into oil. There would also have been a couple of workshops. You needed barrels to store the oil in. There might have been a rough and ready blacksmith's establishment. So yes, it would have been very much focused on what was needed to do the business of whaling.
There are a very substantial number of whaling stations that are established around Cook Strait in this period. And they often are forgotten to history, largely because the whalers were illiterate in many cases, and the real narrative of the 1820s and 30s has been dominated by missionaries, because missionaries wrote. They had to write journals, they had to write letters, they had to say what they were doing, they had to, present what they were doing to their society so they could raise funds for them. And their picture of the world has dominated, and their picture of Europeans who are beyond the pale, who are engaged in the Maori world, who are rough and ready, who are ill-disciplined as they see them, is very much a story of white savages. And they'll have a particular role in debates about intervention in New Zealand. Controlling these people is seen as a major issue. And the New Zealand frontier is an economic edge. It's a place where profits can be made. And keeping rangatira on board is a major objective of governors at the time, because there's so much money that people think that they can make in this world. And it's another example of the extent to which Māori in this period are picking and choosing what part of that European world they want to adopt and use, not seeing it as compromising their capacity to be Māori, and in fact seeing that as not only enhancing that capacity, but at times being essential to maintain mana, essential to maintain one's identity, one's integrity in the face of assaults from other iwi who are using those resources against them.
It was very competitive, partly because the whaling industry was a classic boom and bust. Everybody interested in it took to it with a great deal of enthusiasm. Whales were very quickly overhunted, so that by 1840 the industry was very much in a decline. But it was competitive. Some involved in it made very significant amounts of money. Others didn't do so well. Like any speculative business, the outcomes varied from case to case.
Between the promise of new opportunities and the reality of changing traditions, tension mounted. Despite their differences, Hector found in the Maori world echoes of his own. The values of kinship, storytelling, and respect for the land were familiar, providing a foundation for understanding and respect.
Like a lot of whaling entrepreneurs, after 1840 he turned to the land, and what he in particular did was shifted across the strait and established himself in the Horowhenua region, reasonably close to the town, what's now the town of Levin. He set himself up as a trader. He built a couple of schooners, and in those ships he traded Māori produce, mostly pigs and potatoes, down to the new settlement at Wellington. And this new settlement, of course, presented him and his Māori partners with a ready market. So that was what he did for the next few years.
So the similarities between Scottish and Maori tikanga, there's so many of them, and I think that's part of why he settled so well here, because things were so familiar. Hospitality was very similar. Reciprocity was very similar. Understanding and having full knowledge of a whakapapa was the same. So many interlinking things that were just natural for Hector, which were also natural for iwi. It just intermeshed, and I think that was really helpful. Not everything did, but some of those really key points, did. And I think once Hector had learnt te reo, so he could actually converse and actively listen, that must have grown the opportunity to share and assist and so much more, given him the skill to actually do that.
As cultural bridges were built, the pressures of change were never far away. The Kapiti coast became a place where old traditions met new realities, where Maori and Pakeha worlds collided.
Hector MacDonald is an example of one of these whalers. We call him a Pakeha Māori, which is an interesting term in itself. It was a term used at the time to describe those people who arrived before 1840, who immersed themselves in the Māori world, like Hector, had a Māori wife, and in this case a Māori child, but Māori children. And often some of these families become some of the leading Māori families. They continue on. Their whakapapa is integrated with that of the communities in which they find themselves. The name MacDonald in the Northern South Island is very much connected with a dynasty that continues to the present in one of these early relationships. They're an interesting group because they are living in a world where they're living under tikanga. The Europeans in Britain, and particularly missionaries, find them distasteful. They see them as lawless. They see them as people without the control of law, without the discipline of law, and certainly without Christianity. But they're not living absence of law. They're living under tikanga. They're living under the law of the iwi in which they find themselves, which means that they have to establish mutual relationships with those iwi. They have to benefit each other. Living in that world was often hard. It was often risky. You're living in a world where there's a lot of violence is happening, but the freedom of it is also attractive. Many of these Pakeha Māori after 1840 just faded away. Making that transition to a world when there are governors and courts and laws was extremely difficult, and Hector does that successfully. He manages to take the alliances that he's worked with the different tribal groups into that new world. He manages to be reasonably economically successful for much of his life anyway, and that's a transition that only a very small number of these earlier Pakeha Māoris achieved.